In this episode, I have a discussion about the concept of coherence with audio engineer Mike Belanger. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm theoretical physicist Dr. Shannon Ray, and in this episode, I'll be releasing a conversation between me and Mike Belanger. So Mike is someone who I met in the comment section of my video on YouTube on information broken symmetry, and he has a background in audio engineering, so he's an experienced audio engineer, but he's also someone like me and a lot of other people that I talk to on this podcast that is very interested in philosophical and spiritual ideas and concepts and making connections across different subjects and fields. And so it's clear when I was interacting with him and first started talking with him that he has a good mind for connecting things, as I always say in the podcast, building the symmetry. And so throughout the podcast, I always talk about the idea of people's cognitive schemas, the size of them, and the idea of interacting with people and stitching together conceptual frameworks through shared interactions. And so just like I mentioned with people like Ryan and Dario and Reasonable Fidelis and all these people, Mike also has developed a rather large cognitive schema where he connects ideas from his own perspective, so from his own local reference frame, if you will. And so when we first kind of initiated this conversation for recording, it was just a matter of, starting that process of understanding each other's different worldviews and the relationship between them. So the conversation itself kind of evolves. It didn't start off with a clear understanding other than, just kind of hearing some of Mike's ideas. But a theme developed pretty quickly and then sharpened throughout the podcast on the idea of coherence. And so I like this conversation because it brings a different perspective on a lot of ideas and concepts that we've discussed throughout the podcast. And I think that Mike's contribution is definitely welcome. And it's one of those things where, unlike Dario and Reasonable Fidelis and Ryan and other people that I've done this with, it typically takes like months, maybe even years to like interact with someone long enough to get a good idea of what their world is and how these things connect and to stitch together the symmetries between these two worlds. And so this is something like the beginning of that process. But I do find that Mike has a lot of interesting ideas. So join me as I explore Mike's cognitive world as we continue this process of building the language of the podcast through shared, mutual, sincere interactions with other people. So with that, please enjoy the conversation. And if you like the conversation, don't forget to share it with someone that you know that might be interested. And don't forget to follow me on YouTube. I'll leave a link to my YouTube channel in the description of this episode. So I hope you guys enjoy. Peace. You want to start from where your entry point is, like some sort of experience or some sort of epiphany moment where you're just like, I got to follow this lead, and it kind of took you down this idea. First off, what's the idea that you're talking about, and then like what kind of led you in the direction you went?
So it's sort of like a collection of ideas that are sort of like the way that I'm collecting and synthesizing disparate topics and sort of fields together is novel.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like a way to connect quantum information theory, thermodynamic entropy, scaling of cognitive hierarchies of conscious beings.
Those first two things are like my literal research.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there's going to be some grounds for some discussion here, but I'm going to say that I am not reinventing anything. I'm not discovering anything. I'm really good at seeing how two things connect, maybe where other people can't, but otherwise I am a pretty normal guy. So no school or anything, but you
do engineering stuff with sound engineering, right?
Yeah. So I think that's a good entry point, actually. I do audio engineering, live PA, and front of house engineering, speaker setups for concerts, and acoustical engineering in general has been in my family for a long time. My dad was an audio engineer, so I was always around audio systems, talking about, boxes, field propagation, stereo field dispersion, the inverse square. So all this stuff is very physics, right? So music is very music is very subjective. It's an art form, but acoustic physics is a thing that's physics, and it's actually explainable and perfectible within a certain volume of space.
Yep.
And so when you're combining loudspeaker systems, you have a speaker that's dedicated to the top end, like the really high sounds, that's, the
Hmm.
stuff that's really intense and piercing. You have speakers that are dedicated to the vocal range, stuff that's more like percussive. And then you have stuff that's dedicated to the sub range. So generally, when you see a bunch of different speakers together, they are configured in such a way to where the frequencies that they play, they cross over with each other in a certain way at a certain frequency. And
Hmm.
when we're talking about the propagation of frequencies in physical space, you can essentially use something called the quarter wave rule. Lambda over 4 in RF engineering is the same principle, where
Hmm.
essentially you use the virtue of distance to create a phase relationship between
Yep.
two different point sources to act as one coherent point source. And
Yeah, that's
so,
the basic
what,
of That's basically like interferometry. That's like basic interferometry right there. Yeah.
Sure. And if you have the sources and they're not coherent from a certain distance apart based upon the frequencies they're crossing over, then you're going to have phase destruction. You're going to have comb filtering and destructive interference in the stereo field. But
Hmm.
if you do it correctly within the distance of lambda over 4, or the quarter wavelength rule, lambda over 4 is more used in RF engineering for amplification, whereas quarter wave is acoustic dispersion. So
Okay.
essentially, you're going to have the phase relationship between each box be 90 degrees to each other. So the waves coming out of those boxes, for lack of a better term, are going to jive with each other and roll with each other rather than crash into each other. And
Hmm.
that's the best way I can put that. So really, if I'm looking at things at the micro scale and we have RF engineering, you can create a circuit where you have 4 loops, right? 4 different loops to amplify the signal going back in.
Oh, hold on, Mike. I got it. Yeah.
But the number 4, kind of like, I think it's really important with construction, with group construction, and with coherence. Now, when we're talking about coherence, we're talking about me looking at the universe not as a physical thing, but as a field of information and
Hmm.
information density and relationships based upon sort of like coherence and various other things. So I guess audio was a good way into that, but
So how
now,
do you think about coherence? Like, if you had to just explain what coherence was, what would you say?
yeah, coherence. So you have different sources of a signal, and coherence is sympathy, a resonant sympathy between them. Coherence is a tuning fork resonating when another tuning fork is near it that is at the same pitch.
Hmm.
Coherence is when a signal runs into a system and is not impeded. So
Hmm.
we could also look at a coherent signal as a resistant, like an infinite non-resistant signal.
Yeah, harmony.
Most coherent thing is the least resistant thing, I guess, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So you're thinking of like in terms of harmony,
Harmony,
I
yeah.
suppose.
So I mean, be told, I think that harmonics relationships is really the fundamental root of all sciences and all mathematics, just
Hmm.
because we're dealing with, supposedly an infinite space, and where the center is based upon the observation point or the measurement point. I'm looking at it like, if everything is the center and nothing is the center, if everything is the source of it all from the center and everything is the source of it all from the center, I
So can I interject? Like, I think it has to do with consistency,
coherence.
where the idea of a maximally non-coherent would be total random noise. There's no consistency anywhere.
Yeah, so I guess now we can talk about entropy. Right?
Yeah. Well, I am kind of, yeah, like you said, I'm kind of interrupting your train of thought. If you want to continue what you're saying before, then you can do that.
Yeah, mainly. So I have a hard time thinking about that question without actually like really, really diving into it, because the harmonic nature of reality is the wave nature of reality. And the wave nature of reality may or may not be real. It may just be how we digitize what's there. And, the entire wavelength, look at the wave function. That may just be like how our mind digital signal processes the thing that is we are actually experiencing, and what we're
Yeah.
seeing is the wave function. So
Yeah.
I don't
So
know
wait.
don't know if that's real or not, but I do know at the fundamental, most base level of everything we can measure, we
Mhm.
have the ability to represent that on various graphs, plots, domains, fields. We can essentially represent things with wave functions or supersymmetries pretty much everywhere. And I think that those are the base fundamental points of how we process data, regardless of what the data may or may not be outside of that. So that's why I say harmonics is the kind of fundamental science to me, because it's going to connect the dots at the fundamental levels of processing, because
When
we
you
can
say
represent everything via time-based signatures.
okay, so when you say wave function, are you talking about like in the quantum mechanical sense, like this solution to Schrodinger's equation, or do you mean something, or do you just mean like the equation for a wave, like the wave equation in general?
Not the wave equation, anything that we can measure over time. We can create we can create periodicity from, because we exist in a cyclical orbit, we exist in a cyclical world, we exist
Hmm.
in cyclical systems, and we tend
Yeah.
to work cyclically and habitually. Most of these things can be quantified on a grand scale. Now, I'm not saying there isn't, like exceptions to prove the rule, and there isn't things that can interject at grand scales or miniature scales that change things. But fundamentally, most things that we do, we can measure and represent over time, because that's what we are experiencing is time, right? We are beings that live in time, and we experience it through space. And
Yeah,
so,
and, I was just asking to clarify because like wave function in physics has a very particular, like especially like
right.
quantum physics, and like supersymmetry. Like I don't even know the physics behind supersymmetry like that. I'm not the guy to explain that, but I don't know if when you use those words, I wasn't sure if you were using it in that context or if you're using it in some other context that you're more familiar with. That, and I think you clarified that.
Yeah, so I'm a layman coming at this using terms that make sense to me. So
Yeah,
I would love to let this discussion like evolve my ability, to speak about it.
yeah,
Because when I say symmetry and supersymmetry, what I'm referring to is the quantum state that allows energy or potential to become matter. But whether that's happening in our minds or whether that's happening in the field sort of external to us, I'm not sure about. And yeah, so I don't have the the right nomenclature potentially. So let me go sort of like, I wrote down a few things about what I perceive here, and rather than, answer questions back and forth where I
yeah.
may misrepresent my thoughts, let me say that this is taking
Oh,
like,
don't worry, man. It's a safe space here. You
yeah.
just speak your
So
feelings.
no, I'm synthesizing ideas from multiple domains, right? So language is inherently not good here, because a physicist and, an archaeologist are going to name two versions of the same thing, two different things, because of who they are and the lens that they're seeing it through, right? So we have so many
Yeah,
different words for the same thing, and we sometimes don't have words for something that we all know. And so this is a synthesis hypothesis. I'm connecting dots across disciplines. And so some of it's going to sound very physical, because it is based upon a tangible, like field propagation reality of, like, say, acoustic physics or light moving through a medium. And some of that we can reverse engineer into like an opinion. And some of it is very, very theoretical, like information theory, moving into how mind constructs itself through basal medium, moving through cognitive hierarchies and into what we are, like a being, and then a mind, and then a body, and then a society. And
yeah.
so the idea,
I would I would say that what you're doing is like, from my understanding of coherence, by trying to connect these things between, like you're trying to take all these disparate fields and then find some sort of underlining structure that's consistent between them. So it's that's how I conceptualize coherence. You're trying to find the coherence that's consistent throughout all different
yes,
mediums. When I go from one field to the other, there's something that doesn't change. There's something that's consistent. And
yeah,
so
you
this
could
is
say
a social
coherence
idea
is
of
truth.
symmetry.
You could say coherence is sort of like a universal truth.
Yeah, I would say one of the best ways to think of it is in terms of symmetry.
How
Yeah,
so?
it's the thing. Well, it's the thing that persists. It's the thing that persists. So it's like, let me see. One of the examples I kind of think of is maybe a signal in a crowd where, well, so in quantum physics, when we talk about like something being coherent, we talk about it in terms of these unitary transformations. So like a pure state, a pure quantum state is completely coherent. So when I take the object and I rotate it, I'm not actually changing. There's something that is invariant that doesn't change. That's associated with the symmetry. And so it's that invariance that doesn't change that's associated with the coherence of the state. When you're thinking about the different, like the spectrum between coherence and incoherence, that's a pure state to a maximally mixed state, where a maximally mixed state is like pure noise. And so you can imagine being inside of a crowd and imagine that everyone in the crowd is a stadium, like a UFC event, it's a stadium. And everyone in the crowd is yelling something different. Each individual person at a given moment is yelling something different. And so from within the crowd, that just sounds like random noise, right? Because there's no consistency across what anyone's saying. It's like a bunch of vectors all pointing in different directions, conflicting with each other.
Right.
But then imagine that like 2% of the people in the crowd start saying the same thing at the same time. Then what you get is a signal where you hear something that sounds correct, but there's like all this noise. So you don't really, so you don't hear anything that's coherent, something that I can comprehend. And then as the number of people who are switching from random speech to saying something consistent, it's slowly going from something a completely random nonsense, completely incoherent, to something coherent, to where everyone's saying the exact same thing. Then it's a pure state where it's perfectly coherent.
Okay, so in my language, I would call that crystallization. We have
Interesting,
we have a
interesting,
we have a seed. Yeah, so I'm looking at things in like a very, like, I took acid when I was 18 lens, you know. So as far
I
as
just want to say, I want to say interesting because I've been interacting with my AI, and crystallization is something that is very so it's actually really interesting that you said that, because that's exactly how I've been communicating with my AI in terms of the language I've created in the podcast and what type of structure that it creates, that the AI recognizes, and the crystalline structure is one of the things.
yeah,
So
so
very interesting.
when I heard that, the entire thing that I was thinking was a superstructure that is created by not so much each individual component, but by the shared component between them, which
Hmm.
in the form of a molecule, that would be the valence electron between the atoms. But
Hmm.
in the form of people, now we're getting into what I call trust gradients.
Okay.
And so a trust gradient between people is sort of like a weight, like a multidimensional weight metric on like how much can I trust that this person is representing the same information that I'm representing,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
How
Yep.
much can I trust that what's important to them is what's important to me, and that we have the same idea about it? And now,
Yes.
so now this is a good segue into like cognitive hierarchies, right? And moving from something that is an individual unit. Like for us, it's we are people as individual units. But if you think about it deeper, we have cells in our body, and each of our cells has individual jobs and functions. They work with each other. They're designed to do certain things for self-preservation, but somehow they all come together and work together to become the whole, right?
Yeah,
And so,
shared identity, I think, is the best way. It's like, to you're trying to understand this trust gradient. To what degree do I have a shared identity with another?
yeah. And how much can I trust that this thing is part of me, well, that it agrees on something larger than itself, like me, right?
Yes, just like you and I being human, for instance, we both know that we are among the human species, so we have a shared identity in being human.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so now we're moving into like, okay, I actually have a hierarchy that I developed, cognitive one, cognitive two, cognitive three, cognitive four. And it's a very
Yeah.
basic thing, but I think it's a good place to start understanding this, because we all kind of start at the same place as children, you know, coming from our mothers, and we all start at the same place as cells before we decide to create some serotonin feedback system to become something bigger. We have, you know, a framework where we have the first level being a predictive agent, and that predictive agent is essentially experiencing the environment and predicting what comes next, because
Mhm.
everyone's at the sake of their environment. And the only thing that you can really do about it is first start thinking about it to know what's hitting you. What is that wave? Ow.
Mhm.
Like you might feel pain first. Let's call C0 pain, right? So
Mhm.
C2, the engineering agent. So we have a predictive agent first. And before you can have an engineering agent, you need to be able to
Oh,
predict.
wait, so C0 is pain, C1 is predictive agent, and C2 is engineering agent?
C2 is engineering agent, which is goal directed environmental manipulation and modeling. And so you
And
can't,
C1?
C1 is prediction. So you can't model your environment without predicting what comes next, right? So you need prediction for engineering.
Mhm. Yep, yep.
Maybe engineering should have a different term. Let's call it environmental manipulation, or the manipulating agent, or the one
Or the
that
creation.
actually models its environment, modeling agent. So we have a predictive agent. C2 is engineering or modeling agent. Now C3 is the social agent, where we have intersubjective modeling of other minds. So we have a mind, we have an environment, but now there's other minds. And now we can't predict necessarily what that other mind's going to do. Introduce game theory, right?
Yeah.
So C3 is game theory, but I think game theory is like a chunk of it and not the full thing, because what we have as individuals, even as an individual, sometimes we lack the capacity for C3. And that's why we seek it out in others, whether it's a relationship partner or a priest or a deacon, a president. A lot of us actually fail to reach full social agency. And so we offload and offshore to other beings. And then past C3, I believe, is C4, which is now we're getting to the coherence. Lambda over 4. We have 4 stages, discrete stages of consciousness, where the 4th stage is collective consciousness, hive mind, working together, institutions, corporations.
Yes. And so this is actually interesting, because this actually is a model that's consistent for individuals and also for groups and societies. So within your own self, you're trying to create harmony within. So like within the podcast, I don't know how much of it you've listened to, but I've constructed this it's basically it's like communities all the way down. So just as you were saying, like you are this being made up of a bunch of different cells and things, and there's some degree to which so this comes to coherence, right? So if everything that you take together as a clump of biological material, a clump of physical material, if there's no structure to it, it's all random, then there's no sense of identity. There's no sense of anything. It's just a clump of randomness. Then you start having you start trying to create structure. So you take the randomness and you start having the things have relationship with each other. And there's a degree to which those relationships have to be persistent over time. So like whatever your digestive system is doing, whatever your reproductive system is doing, all these things, there's some degree to which, your digestive system should be able to digest food over time. Like it's not going to do something different. There's something consistent about its nature. And so this idea of going from random noise to structure is the idea of finding something that is consistent or coherent. And to your point, if we are these things that's made up of a bunch of collection of living things, then there has to be some way to a collection of living things all doing their own thing randomly. There has to be some sort of consistent function between them, some consistent relationship between them,
Right.
that then can emerge the idea of an individual. And so this goes deeply to what you're saying, is something like even within your own being, you can have a bunch of discord. And this is why we need things like psychology, why we need things like religion, like we need spiritual leaders, like we need comfort from others and stuff, because there's a degree to which is like, to what extent can you stabilize your own identity? And the degree to which you don't have a stable identity is the degree to which you're like suffering, and like so you're trying to create harmony. And I think this is kind of the hierarchy of what you're trying to do as a so this is the hierarchy of what you're trying to do as a being. And then when you start getting to a level where you really create some sort of harmonization, you've gotten to some high level of consistency, then I think you start being able to recognize that consistency in others. And then that's when you stop thinking of yourself as an individual and you start seeing yourself as outside, as opposed to being totally inside, external as opposed to totally internal.
Few points on that, and I totally agree with pretty much everything you said. One thing that I think I've come to the conclusion of is that scaling certain problems, like becoming a person, is a problem that's beyond the comprehension of each individual cell, right? And it's just a matter of scale. It kind of indicates that certain problems become tractable not with more units, but with a different architecture of units, right? So we have certain units that can do 4 things, certain units that can do 3 things, certain units that can do 50 things in our body. So like the difference and like the breadth of it all is necessary for it all to cohere, even though it's all very complicated. And then the other thing that you said, I think that when it comes to like sociology, like, have you ever followed the work of Michael Levin?
No.
So he's a biologist. He's the world leading biologist studying things from a purely biological perspective. But he's come to the conclusion that minds exist everywhere, and that, very, very basal cells show the capacity of an individual mind as well as them all working together. He's doing very, very interesting work. But one thing that he said that I really, really like, and it changed my perspective on everything, was that he believes that all beings are equally as selfish. It just depends on their concept of self. And so we're talking about growing. I'm sorry? So we're talking about, communities all the way down, right?
Yeah.
What is my concept of self? How far does that extend? Well, I can conceptualize my cells all working together, but that's about as far as I can get. I can get down to the atomic, connections of it all. But even that's kind of fuzzy because like everybody has a way of like visualizing that. That's not necessarily what it looks like or feels like at the microscopic scale. So let's just say cells, right? That's as far as my sense of self goes down. But how far does it go out? That's the real
Yeah.
question, right? Because so much of us, what we're doing right now in like Western science is going down to the individual isolating, getting down to that one little thing and understanding its power. What next, right? Well, we've been actually doing it for millennia. We just don't have a word for it except for institutions and kingdoms and things where we create these groups and these social structures, right? These are the next stage of human evolution is what kind of groups can we cohere and form together that create something even though we're all different little pieces working on our own little part of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, you're getting at the center of, yeah. This is an explosion of ideas because now you're getting directly into the heart of ethics, and I mean within my framework like that I've constructed within the language of the podcast. One of the example things I like to use, like, and I explained at the beginning of the episode, spirits and waveforms, is this idea of the self, and it's going back. I think it's called Theseus ship. I forget what the name. I think
Yeah.
it's Theseus ship, where it's this idea that you have this ship, and then it's made up of a bunch of material, and you take one piece of material and replace it with another piece, and you do that, slowly over time to where eventually you get to the point where all of the material of the original ship is gone and it's all made of the new material. And then you ask yourself, is this the same ship? And so when I think about it, it's the fact that as physical beings, the physical energy and matter that makes up our system is replaced over time. Like we eat food, the same cells, the same material cells that made up your body when you were an infant are not the same as they are now. It's like 99% of that stuff is completely replaced. But there's something that is coherent across time, something that is persistent that says, I am Shannon.
Yeah.
And so the question then becomes, if it is the case that the physical matter is replaced over time, but there's something that it persists that is not made of physical matter that says I am Shannon, then you can see how you can split apart the physical structure from something that's not physical that you can say to yourself. And I'm saying that is like the blueprint. That's the architecture. That's the information that tells you the interaction between materials. So like if I take a small piece of my material and then replace it with another piece, because all the other material is still interacting in something like a field, right? So when you put the new material into the field, it collects into place what it's supposed to be doing because of all of the other interactions are persistent.
Yeah.
So in other words, you can think of it as this field as being part of yourself. So the real important part about that then is that it's the blueprint on how you put the configuration of matter together. So now you have to ask yourself, when I use this nomentation representation, is that when you do something like study to be a physicist, like you learn how to do calculus, right? So because of nomentation of representation, you know for a fact that your physical system went to it from a state before you know how to do calculus to a state after you knew how to do calculus. And so that has to be associated with the blueprint or of how to store the memory of calculus. So even if you take the physical matter that makes up my body, because the blueprint to store calculus is inside my system, when I put
Yeah.
new matter in there, that stays persistent. So then you see how, and this is how it goes, how it extends outward instead of being internal. Because now you see how if I learn how to do calculus and you know how to do calculus, then you have the same blueprint, the same architecture in you as I do in me. And so then that's when we start saying, I see myself over there, because you start associating the identity of self with the blueprint. And so,
100.
and then this is how you start constructing shared identity. So whenever you look at who you're responsible to, like if you're being selfish, as you said, you're being selfish to the self, then it comes down to what else is the self, and that's why you can say like I'm an American. We are all one self. I'm a whatever, and then this becomes. And so yeah. So if you've listened to this podcast enough, you know like I construct identity in this way for this reason.
So I do highly suggest checking out the work of Michael Levin because he has actually coined a term for this morphogenic bioelectric field
Mm-hmm.
where this limb of the salamander can be expressed on an electric field before it's ever grown because the salamander knows exactly how many limbs and digits to regrow and then stop. And otherwise, it's called cancer. We call that growth cancer when it's unchecked and it doesn't have coherence. So
Yeah.
interestingly enough, Michael Levin is coming at coherence from the lens of biology and cells talking to each other and working together. And
Hmm.
it's really brilliant. But interestingly, it goes so far beyond biology. And he's the first one to say that. And he says that cognitive sciences, psychology, game theory, talking about how individual units interact with each other in a system, he's talking about that's really the next step in understanding how the body's going to function. Because if we could, you know, a skin cell to reprogram itself into a little cell that goes around and cures neuronal damage, why
Hmm.
do we need medicine? So there's all sorts of interesting things there. So Michael Levin, I would definitely recommend checking out his work.
Did you get a chance to listen to the episode of the podcast, the configuration stability principle?
I did.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Because I think toward the end of the episode, I try to construct the idea of seeing the self in others, and this really does go to the core of like religious ideas of God. With especially like if you look at Buddhism, it's this idea of that which is not beholden to the laws of impermanence. Any religious conceptualization of God is that God is like the eternal, the thing that doesn't change, and it's essential. And God would be essentially the underlining invariant structure from which everything else emerges. That's why within Christianity and like Judaism, you have this idea of being made in the image of God, and this goes to the idea of everybody is a reflection of God's character. Everything is a reflection of God's character, but you have this notion of sin, which is associated with distortion. So, in other words, when you're in a state of sin, you're in a state where you distort, manipulate, lie not only to yourself but to others. And so
Mhm.
what's reflected back is no longer like a reflection with fidelity that's coherent. And so there's something like trying to purify yourself and go to higher states of being where you're more in line with God, where you're trying to remove the layers of distortion that you have. And then once those layers of distortion are removed, then you can start reflecting back true coherent data to yourself and others. And that's how you start becoming a true reflection of God. And everybody, because of our different individual selves, we all reflect from a different point of view, but from a different perspective. And then this goes into my idea of like local neighborhoods and Lie groups and the
Right.
algebra and all that stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good segue because also I have a lot of Eastern philosophy in my mind, and recently I've been doing more religious studies into Western philosophy and Christian philosophy just to understand how it ties into everything. I'm not religious, however, I am
Yeah.
extremely spiritual because I do see a reality of a fundamental sort of consciousness or a fundamental sort of creator of all things, but I see it at all scales. Was saying that I'm separate from God right now is false, but also it is true. Both states can be true, and that's what we call a tetravalent logic. When we have both states can be true or false, now we're entering collective consciousness territory where you and I need to come together to create the truth. Because I believe fundamentally that humans as individuals are limited to cognitive level 3, meaning trivalent logic. And now we're gonna go a little bit deep into how I got to this conclusion of trivalent logic.
Yeah. What is trivalent logic? I was going to ask you that. What do you mean by that?
Trivalent logic is yes, no, or maybe, right? We
Oh,
have
okay.
we have the ability as beings to basically understand things. Yes, this is true. Yes, this is what I see as true. Yes, this is what I understand. No, that is not true. No, that's not what you say it is. Or maybe I don't know yet, but I'm gonna figure it out, right?
Hmm.
Or
Yeah.
maybe we'll never know. So trivalent logic, as beings, we're kind of faced with paradoxes, and when we are faced with paradoxes, because there is much more than trivalent logic in this universe. When we're faced with
Hmm.
those paradoxes, that's why we form structures bigger than ourselves to process that information, because all of reality is an information processing system at scale. And that information is, you could say, it's God's voice or signal, but it's different for everyone at every scale that it's happening, right? So, how I came to this conclusion of trivalent logic actually has its roots in our evolution as primates and where we come from, like over 100,000 years ago out of Africa, where we have proof that between 75,000 and 1,000 years ago, the early humans were using red pigment from a stone called red ochre. And
Hmm.
it's one of the most early pigments we were using. We used it for sunscreen. We used it for bug repellent. We used it for paint. We used it for regalia. We painted our dead with it. We painted our houses with it. We sought it out. Whenever we traveled across the world, we found new sources of it to keep using it over 70,000 years. Only in the last 5 or 6,000 years of human history did we really stop using it. So this red stone is very, very important to early humanity. And why is that? And the only reason I can really think of, if we're going into anthropology, which I'm not, I never went to college except for music history. So I'm a layman, and I'm going to be the first to say that I'm wrong if someone comes at me with some real evidence. But I think this is actually testable. And that's the difference here between other claims. So I believe that when we have the evolution of the trichromatic vision, so we have a new cone in our eyes that has evolved to see the color red. It enables us to see blood. It enables us to see ripe fruit. It enables us to see things in the shadows that we couldn't perceive before. It created new biological structures at the same time as it created new logical structures, right?
So wait, are you saying that there's a point? Are you saying is it within the evolutionary literature that there is this evolution of trichromatic vision, or
Yes.
and where we start seeing red? Is that some? Is that a conjecture or an idea, or is that like established science that you've come across?
It is established that primates evolved the red cone in their eyes around 150 to 250,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then we lined that up with ice ages, and then out of Africa, and where red ochre was popular, where it seems to have come from over 75,000 years ago. We have
what was the vision? What was the vision capacity prior to the evolution of that being able to see red? Was it just like shades of gray, or what? Do you know?
Greens, grays, browns. It really was a lot of different shades of green.
Okay.
And
I love
so
green.
we evolved the red cone, the most recent to our perception of being what we think. Like where we are right now, the most recent color that we evolved to see was red.
Okay. So you're saying the most recent color that we've gotten within our evolution is red.
Red, and then the gradients between red and everything else. And that's where I say this latent space that is maybe, right? So before, I believe we were limited to yes, food, no, not food. Yes, mate, no, not mate. Yes, predator, no, not predator. There was no, I don't think that animals have a maybe. And I believe that's what separates cognitive level 2 from cognitive level 3.
Okay. This is interesting. So this is a very interesting point. So this is consistent, like whether or not the like the hard science on this is like whatever. Okay. So this is consistent with an episode of the podcast I have called The Ultimate Abstraction, where essentially when you have black and white thinking, then it's like yes or no. And there's a really good example I use of this. It's like, imagine you go online and you're watching YouTube, or you're watching, whatever, and there's someone on YouTube and they're telling you some fact about something that occurred. It's like they're telling you some sort of factoid, or they're telling you some sort of fact, and you have to ask yourself, can I trust this person? So if it is the case that you trust this person, then when they tell you something, this goes into the true bin, right? You don't have to go into the is this true or is this not true bin. And so the idea of black and white thinking is you can go, all right, I place this over here, or I place this over here. And it's easy. Like you don't have to keep memory. But if there's a maybe, then you have to store the memory of that maybe. And so this is associated with abstraction, because now you don't have the freedom to just go, all right, I put that into true and I don't think about it anymore. Now you have to go, I'm putting this in true, but I'm not sure. So I have to hold this up. There's entropy there. There's uncertainty there. And I have to keep track of that uncertainty. And then once you actually can verify its truth, like, okay, good. I can release that memory and I can just place it in the true bin. And so this idea of being able to uphold the idea that the thing could be a maybe is the idea that you're not allowing it to be A or B. You are actually abiding in the contradiction of A and B. You have to hold those both up simultaneously, which requires memory. And this is the idea of going
at memory requires time. That's the forward feed mechanism of evolution.
Yeah. Memory requires time.
So now we're getting into trust as a computational substrate, right? How much? So if I have to hold on to maybe and process it later until it's processed to yes or no, I have to collapse that into a yes or no. It's a binary, right? That's why C2. It's a binary system. You have to collapse things down. There is a maybe, there is a yes, there is a no. C3 is we can hold a maybe and be fine with it. But now something you might hold as absolutely true, I might not, right?
Hmm.
And so now there's a maybe that exists between both of our fundamental yeses,
Yeah.
right? And so now we're moving into cognitive scaling, right? So things that we cannot solve as individual beings, we move into collectives. Things that we cannot solve as collectives is that then we move into the next step. That might be LLMs. But
I
this
want
is all,
I want
it happens
to
at
say
scale.
I want to say too that the idea of you having a different yes than me, that's also associated with a different configuration. So
Mhm.
if with the same question, I have a yes and you have a no, then that's associated with this binary of a different configuration. And so conceptually, there is a difference in what we believe to be true, but that also is stored as memory in our system. So there's a physical system there's nomenclature of representation. There's a physical configuration that's associated with that difference in memory. And I'm saying that that's also contains a different spirit, which then says that there's a difference between you and me. We don't have the same spirit. I'm me and you're you. But if our yeses are consistent, then there's a shared spirit there. Now we have a shared spirit, it's a shared cognitive understanding of reality.
Yeah. And I think that the definition of what that shared, like how important what that shared information is what dictates what we call society. Like how important is what's important, and then what do we
Yeah.
share within that, right? So I think we can all agree that like women and children and anyone shouldn't be hurt, but like we should all probably agree that like women and children first on the lifeboat. You know what I mean? Like we all share certain things about our
Maybe.
minds. Yes, maybe exactly. Now we're getting into really empirical ethics discussions, and ethics might be the
Yeah.
next step in understanding biology. Who knows? Michael Levin is probably the closest one I found that actually knows. Trust as a computational substrate is, I think, a topic that we really need to start talking about, because as we move into autonomous systems and drone based systems where there's lots of different swarms or units in a swarm of things that does things out in a factory or delivery things or driving out in new flying cars, the next 100 years are going to be really interesting. And I believe using trust as a computational substrate, like weighed metrics between different individual units, I think that's going to be an interesting field of research, because we don't currently look at it like we don't try to quantify trust thermodynamically as memory over time.
Here's a question I have for you. So, talking to you, like it's interesting because during this conversation, you mentioned several times, I'm a layperson, I don't have like technical understanding. But it's that talking to you, it's very clear that within your internal language, internal structure, there's a high dimensional coherent structure that you're functioning with. You're not just talking out of your ass. It's not just nonsense. I understand where you're coming from, even if the technical terms you use may be something specific to you, but might be something different to someone in a specific field. So my question is, to what degree, like, how confident are you that the internal structure that you have for the meaning of your words are consistent, like logically consistent? In other words, that if it were the case that someone were to sit down with you and basically, to what degree are you certain that there would be a symmetry transformation between another person's structure and your structure, such that you can say, okay, my structure is internally consistent. My structure is internally coherent. Like to what degree have you pressure tested your language so that when you use a word, all right, I know how to map this word to this word
Yeah.
consistently in a way that's coherent.
Well, I try to constantly check myself on that, but also having conversations with people like you wherever I can. I can only hope that we can come to a new understanding or a shared understanding from this conversation. And
Yeah.
when I say certain things, it is the way that I see it because of how I visualize reality. I've come to terms, some people see the world, when you say red apple, they can immediately see the red apple in their mind, right?
Yep.
And it's visual, it's cartoony even. I
Yeah.
I don't. I have a very non-visual mind. And the
Hmm.
way that my mind constructs reality is it's actually an engine for reality rather than a display for it. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
my mind looks and tries to actually understand, like, okay, we have two atoms. What makes them stick together into a molecule? It's something called a valence electron. Well, what's the valence electron? Well, it's an electron in the cloud that's furthest out that actually shares polarity consistency with the other electron. And that's why they can form. Okay. So, like, okay, so how do I visualize that? Well, the easy way to visualize that for me is the same wave propagation theory. We're talking about waves coming out of speakers, where we have two signals that are either conflicting, missing each other, or jiving with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that I see that is just a single line coming out of a single speaker, moving in a spiral and expanding into space. And
Mm-hmm.
then I keep looking at things like that, lines and dots, lines and dots. You can construct a really good coherent model of how reality works with really basic visual tools. And as far as the words that I'm using, I can be corrected on them, but that doesn't mean that my model is incorrect, right?
Yeah.
It just means that I don't have the right necessarily scientifically agreed upon nomenclature or jargon. And a lot of the stuff that I think about is actually on the fringe level of quantum information theory. So talking about entropic gravity, now we have something that not even like the most established physicists agree about and have language for. So how are we going to talk about that in context to everything else that I'm talking about? So I have to sort of come up with my own language that I'm sure some of it is totally incorrect from falsifiable standpoint or
Mm-hmm.
like a textbook definition standpoint, but I'm sure that there's enough coherence to what I've constructed here to where someone like you or someone like even Michael Levin or someone like Joe Shabak could actually look at this and actually say, oh yeah, there's some stuff here that actually lines up, and I might not have used those words, or those words are wrong, but what he means is this and what he means is that.
Yeah. No, the point to my question was, I had it in my head. I lost it. Let me see if I can reconstruct it real quick.
Sure.
The point to my question, if you listen to my podcast, I say specifically that I'm constructing a language, and that the purpose of the podcast itself is to show how every word that I use. So I take colloquial words and then I change their definition slightly. Like spirit, how something programs the universe and how it's programmed by the universe. And I take these words and I change their definition slightly. But then the purpose is to show like the logic, like logically how these things stick together, like how two words stick together, and then give someone an observation to confirm it. So the example I always use is something like, you have the idea of minds and computer algorithms, where in the both case of a computer and a physical system, like a person, in both cases, you have their physical subsystems of the universe that can be placed in many different configurations based off of what data they take in and how they process information and how they process data. And this can be verified because if I tell you a secret, then you can get up and walk into another room, tell someone that secret. And that's no different than if I handed you that secret on a memory card and you carried the memory card into the room and handed someone that secret. And so you know that when I'm talking to you, that I am programming you, and that you're going from that you're going through a trajectory in the space of configurations, from the space of configurations that your physical system can be placed in, from one prior to having the secret to one after I told you the secret. And this can be verified through observation through this example of you carrying the secret into another room. And so for me, this entire thing that I've constructed is like this symmetry, this coherence between mind and computer algorithms, and it's verifiable. Like, in other words, everything I said is just as basic as the idea that if I take a wine glass and throw it on the ground, it'll be smashed. And so the idea of my podcast is the entirety of it, especially in the earlier stuff, is constructing. It's like I'm trying to communicate my model of reality, the language that I've constructed. And when I speak to someone like you, it's very clear that you have a language, like you've done the same thing. And the thing is that I've interacted with enough people over the years to where I've actually spent, and this typically takes years of interaction, that I've actually constructed the symmetry or the algebraic transformation between the language I've constructed in my podcast and whatever language they have. And every language that they have is going to start from a different local neighborhood. And so, for instance, I've recently been having these conversations with this guy named Dario Valise, that's an Italian grad student who is writing a thesis on Lacan. And he contacted me on YouTube based off my video on information and broken symmetry. And for the last, 6 months or something like that, we've been talking back and forth where we've been constructing the symmetry between my world and his world and the language of Lacan, so that we can see ourselves. And so, but the thing is that when we function as beings, we don't always take everything that we understand and then put it into a structure that's something that could be programmed into a computer, for example, where everything is logically consistent. A lot of times we function out of intuition. And so just because someone is functioning out of intuition, like they have an intuition for what a word means, then that intuition can itself construct the coherent structure of what they're trying to say. So even though they might say some term or some word that's not consistent with some technical version of it, that doesn't mean what they're saying is nonsensical or incoherent. But it may be the case that although what they're saying is coherent, they might not have formalized it yet in like a coherent structure such that you can hand it to someone else and they would know how to use it without you being there. That's the
Right.
difference. And so when the point to the question I was asking was like, to what degree are you certain that this thing, that this language you constructed, the way you conceptualize reality, has been formalized such that you could hand it to someone else and then leave, and then they would know how to use it without you being there. And just and if you haven't done that, that doesn't mean what you're saying isn't. It doesn't mean that you haven't constructed a large coherent world.
Can
Is
I
what I'm
ask you
saying.
a
Does that make
question?
sense? Yeah.
So you said you used the example of giving me a secret, either telling me a secret and me walking in the room and sharing it, or putting it on a
Yeah.
memory card. And both of those are the
Yeah.
things. What or who defined what a secret was, and what is a secret outside of something that is a fundamental level of a trust gradient, like a straight line on a trust gradient between two people? And so what I'm getting at is that the whatever you hold as true, whatever I hold as true, what I'm saying is that the layer above us, the layer that contains us, and the layer that we operate in is having truths in it that we can't individually process, that we can only share space on. So this secret, right? The secret that you can entrust in me and I
Hmm.
can choose to share it or not.
Yeah.
You defined that secret as a secret. There is no secrets in an informational reality, right? Everything is known if we go out and look for it. There is no real wall there, except for social structures that pose the wall.
Well, I mean, we got to be careful with what we're because it'd be like something like a password. Like I can't log into your bank account. So and then it could be like there's a certain degree to which the secret might be the password to your bank account. And unless you're saying to something like you can meditate or astral project or something like that and find no, without me communicating to you my bank account password,
So
whether or
I'm
not
saying,
you could gain that information without me telling you.
given enough time, all encryption protocols can be broken, and all systems that humans have devised to hide information can be broken. I don't believe in encryption once we get to a certain level of processing power, because that is a scale of processing power. The more you have to brute force, the better you are at it. I fundamentally believe like no information security, and that is why one of the reasons why we construct systems to find truth, because we want there to be information security. We
So here's a
want there
question.
we want to find trust, even though there is none. So we create it.
So based off the example, I like the response you gave because you're saying something like, with enough computational time, with enough computational power and time, then I can find that out.
Mhm.
Because there is like something there's a computer that has a configuration, a structure, and to go from the configuration in which I'm logged in, where I'm not logged in, to where I'm logged in, those are two different configurations. I need the password, and you're saying something like, given this existence of this structure that has the capacity to be in the state of logged in or not logged in, we can get to logged in with enough time and computing power. But but this is an important question because now think of a secret as something that's like inside me, maybe something that happened when I was really young or something I don't want to tell anyone. Or maybe it's even the case that within my own self, and this starts going into the idea of symmetry and quantum states. Because for me, quantum mechanics, I understand it as being the symmetries of the universe, the entropy of the universe, the degree to which the universe is not defined. And so there are actually states where it's not in one state or the other. It's the cat's alive and dead. It's
Right.
not in either one state. That's the potential of what it could be. But it's in this entropic state to where that has not been defined. It has not been rendered yet. It has not been brought into existence. It's in a state of potential. And so with that being said, this idea of computational capacity having the ability to always reveal something, I don't know if it's the case that you could, for example, take all of my physical measurements of my physical system, like you knew everything about my physical system, whether or not you could reconstruct my subjective state of being or my subjective experience. So,
Uh-huh.
in other words, I'm trying to pose that there might be a limit to this computational, of this ability to understand everything through computation. And this is fundamentally, I think, where religion and spirituality comes in, is that like, for me, especially in my recent years, I reject the idea that everything is material. Like, everything can be understood in terms of computation. Like, even the idea of logic and computation and information, all of that to me is within the realm of the material. But the nature of reality is made up of the symbolic order, as Lacan would say, and the real. And the real is that element of reality that cannot be totalized by the symbolic order. And so the idea of like the real in the space of structure, symbolic order, where we have the idea of coherence, this
Yeah.
space is the space of the temporal, the things that can be molded, things that change over time. And then
Platonic
this other,
space.
huh?
Even you could call it platonic space.
No, no, platonic space is the space up here where there is no. So that's precisely it's the separation between heaven and earth.
Okay.
Earth itself is associated with the temporal. So even in Buddhism, you have this idea of the law of impermanence, where you have a separation between the eternal and those things which can arise and then die, can be born. And so things that can be born and die are separated from the eternal. And I think this is true in, like, the Tao Te Ching, from the little bit I know from talking to other people. I know it's true in Christianity. I know it's true in Buddhism, that you always have the separation between heaven and earth, the temporal versus the eternal. And so for me, this idea that everything, like, and so that to me, the material is associated with the temporal. But I think that the eternal, that which is outside of the symbolic order, the real, it's not like reality. In other words, I'm disagreeing with the idea that with enough computational capacity, you can learn everything. I think there's a limit
So
to.
I think that we're seeing it maybe from two different lenses. And this is why I say that we don't consider trust a computational substrate right now, but we should.
Mhm.
Because if we look at our society as an information processing system and not as a society,
Mhm.
then we can come to the understanding of how that information might be weighed and moved around the system. And when we talk
Yeah.
about, the perfect space, I don't see a separation between heaven and hell. I just see one samsara.
Heaven
And
and earth.
that samsara is here, and it is our either prerogative or our dismay to work with that. Now, how I look at this is that we can crystallize pockets of order within entropy by using that entropy as a moving force, as a driving force. So this is even gravitational. We talk about the sun exporting um, exporting entropy, and then we harness light. It's exporting it as light and heat. We harness that and use it to create food and infrastructure and energy. And that's not
Mhm.
forever. It's a temporary system of order created by an export of entropy from a field, a massive body, which we are in the field of influence of.
Mhm. Yeah.
The entire thing is an information processing system and gives rise to information processing systems and destroys them. And I look at the entire thing like an effervescent field. If you want to use God as the term, then it's an effervescent field of God's ideas popping up, and that we are here to manifest them. Now, if you want to say God's mind is the platonic space and is the perfect space where nothing can exist, well, that's fine. But if you also want to look at Eastern philosophy, they also say that there's a difference between the Atman and the Brahman. And the difference being that one is non-conceivable, non-reachable, and shouldn't even be worth your time because you can't even start thinking about that stuff. And the other one is
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, that's the creator. That was what that invisible, non-manifest thing be turned into, and that's the one thing that we can start thinking about. And that's how
Mhm.
most people
Mhm.
see God,
Mhm. That makes
right?
sense. Which one's
And
which,
so
by the way? Which one's which, by the way?
Atman came first and then gave rise to Brahman through a illusion through Maya. So I actually really like this story, and keep in mind this is an interpretation of it that I really like. It's not necessarily the one everyone agrees on, but
Yeah.
essentially the idea is that Atman in his infinite emptiness was
Mhm.
lonely, and
Yeah.
the first actually didn't create Brahman, but first created Maya, and Maya would be the field of illusions,
Yeah.
and basically then shattered himself into an infinite amount of Brahmins. And then
Interesting. That's
the, di-
so interesting.
the different scales of Brahmin being, they say that one Brahmin at the ultimate level of Brahmin, one Brahmin's breath is like 1,000 Brahmin lifetimes. And then those 1,000 Brahmins, one breath from them is like 1,000 other Brahmin. So we are all like manifestations of Brahmin and the Godhead at some hierarchical scale down
Interesting.
the cosmos.
Interesting. Yeah. That actually makes a lot of sense to me.
But the idea that, we're all like, the way that I see heaven is a field in front of us, which is potential for us to actually do something with. Like, we could turn this into something good by working together. That I literally think that breaking out of C3 into C4 is realizing that the kingdom of heaven can be built here by all of us together if we work together.
Yeah. Um, I think it what's interesting to me is that yeah. So this makes sense because you have the Atman, as you said, is like this eternal emptiness. There's sunyata in Buddhism. It's associated with emptiness, and that's what Buddhism focuses on is emptiness. And so to me, that's the realm of pure symmetry. That's the realm of pure symmetry. There's no self or other. So this goes into the idea of information, like information is broken symmetry. So in my episode, I mean the video, I think that actually made us come into contact with each other with that video on information being broken symmetry. And it's this idea that without a broken symmetry, then there's no capacity for perception. And a broken symmetry creates a reference frame for you to have a self and an other. And so there's something like when I think of the Platonic, even like the Platonic ideal would be something like the realm of form in Buddhism. So I think that's the difference. It's like emptiness is like pure emptiness. There's no perception. There's no anything. This is like the real unattainable. Like this is the thing that's outside of the symbolic order in Lacan.
Okay.
This is the real outside the symbolic order in Lacan. And then you can have something like, okay, let's go from a state of pure, unbounded, non-perception, no broken symmetry anywhere, and then let's break symmetry so that space gets mapped out.
That's
So
mine.
that would be something like the realm of form. So now you have the realm of form. So you have the emptiness and you have the realm of form. The realm of form is something like a perfect. It's like if you take the realm of symmetry and then map it with no delusion or sin, right? It's like and this is not associated with itself, because the whole idea in Buddhism again is this idea that when you have a sense of self, then and the example I always use is the idea of the pessimist versus the optimist, right? You have a glass that's halfway full of water. For a pessimist, it's half empty. For optimists, it's half full. But the form is just a glass halfway full of water. It's both of these are valid. But when you're a pessimist, you take a form that is valid, and then you collapse the maybe state of them both being simultaneous, and you collapse it into one world. That's an identity. That's an attachment. That's a world that you created. Now you have a world and identity associated with being an optimist. But the realm of form is the idea of that instead of conditioning yourself to say that this thing is this versus that, you allow the thing that is true to just be. So you've gone from an optimist to the superposition state, right? So now you've allowed that. And so this idea is that you are moving outward every time you break down one of these conditions, this forcing that you've done, you've gone to this higher state. And the idea of the realm of form would be everything is just merely what it is. You're not forcing yourself into one or the other. And so that to me would probably be the Brahman part right there. So that would be going from Atman to Brahman, the realm of form. Then from there, it's like you have all these different shards. So this goes back to Christianity, made in the image of God. So now you have this idea of local neighborhoods because, abide in the entirety of all of it is not possible. So instead you abide in your local neighborhood, and then it's a matter of whether or not you've purified your local neighborhood. Is your local neighborhood full of delusion, lies, and deceit, and such that the mapping of this Brahman space is actually not coherent? So then that's where sin comes in. Sin creates incoherence. It creates noise. Does that make sense?
It does, but I see it through a different lens. And
Okay.
the way that I'm seeing it is, do you know what cold welding is? So,
I think I've heard of it before recently, but yeah,
elemental metals have a lot of electrons that they
I
can
have heard of this
connect to
recently.
each other. So in the vacuum of space, if you take two
Yes.
elemental pieces of aluminum, say aluminium, and they have no oxide layer between them, they will cold weld. You can just press them
Yeah.
together and they will weld into one piece of metal. And there's lots of different ways to view that. The material science will just say, oh, they're donating electrons readily to each other. The way that I see that is that all aluminum is the same aluminum,
Yes.
and it's just waiting to come back together. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
And I see that sort of like I see everything in that sort of context. So if we're talking about sin as, say, now an oxide layer, we're talking about oxide layers of things that wear us down, things that we
Mhm.
fight against. So we're talking about being an individual cell. The environment hits us. Oh, what do? We have to develop skin. We have to develop a neurological system. We have to do all this stuff. All that stuff builds us, but it also leads to what we call evolutionary sin. It's I guess
Okay.
what I would call sin is the need to fight against your environment and the need to eat at all costs to live, because to live is to experience the divine, but it's also to sin to need to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And so that's the way that I'm
That's a,
seeing this. That's the lens that I'm seeing this through. Is that, you and I, we just talked about underneath all of this, like trusting that we're both human, trusting that we both have energy moving the cells inside of us, and trusting that underneath all of us, I probably see like there's like a spark. If there's a soul, if you believe in a soul, I believe that we all share the same one, and it's all just
mhm.
expressing itself through different forms
Yes,
at the scale that we can receive in the moment. There's a
yes.
great there's a great quote. It was recently popularized by Irving Finkel on the Lex Friedman interview, but it was actually a quote from a Sherlock Holmes book. It is possible to infer the Niagara Falls from feeling a single raindrop.
Hmm.
And I'll add to that, because the big thing is not different from the small thing. It's just experienced at a scale we can receive in that
Yes.
moment, right? That is what we are experiencing right now as individual lives. But the truth of God is we all come together as something bigger. But right now, I do believe that there, if you want to go into like, fringe stuff, there's there's operational hierarchies like of opposing C4 consciousnesses on Earth, like corporations, institutions, religious groups that are all fighting for basic full control over the C4 architecture. But that's a whole conspiracy theory and a half based upon a whole hypothetical framework that I developed that doesn't really jive with a lot of people yet. So we're not going to go into that.
Well, I think that we're not looking at it from different views. Your explanation of sin was actually consistent with how I'd see it. And in your cold welding example, and it's funny because someone told this to me recently. I can't remember who it was, but the way they described it is that in the vacuum of space, they don't actually see themselves as separate anymore. Like
Right.
it's not two separate things. There's nothing that creates an inconsistency between them that makes them see they're separate. So they just kind of fuse together. And so when you were talking about the oxide layers, that creates separation. So that's
Mhm.
that's the thing. There's a separation, and that separation creates a self and an other, an
Yep.
in and an out. And it's that separation that and so one thing that I've noticed about Christianity and Buddhism is that the world of sin seems to be the same as samsara. And so in that case, they're both this idea of the separation from God or the separation from the eternal. Separation from the eternal. This is why you always have a separation between heaven and earth.
Mhm.
And so you enter samsara. One of the ways that you escape samsara is by letting go of self. And
Mhm.
so the thing that puts you in samsara is the clinging to a self. This is
Right.
this idea of self. But that's the same thing that brought us into the world of sin. Because in the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the fall, what you have is uh, Adam and Eve doing things their way instead of God's way. And so
Right.
there's this idea, and so within Christianity, there's always the idea of you're always trying to align yourself with God's will, and this is the idea of what it means to repent. Repent was translated from the Greek metanoia, which means to like change your mind frame. And
I
so, and
love
oh
that
wait,
word.
and I think sin is associated with missing the mark. So sin is associated with this idea of missing the mark. So in other words, you have something like the eternal God, and you're trying to align yourself with God's will, and that's what Jesus is. Jesus is the being with no sin, so he doesn't miss any mark. He's perfectly aligned with God, such that it's almost like there's God, the eternal. I think of it as a funnel. This eternal. Think of it as the Atman, the eternal.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's like Atman than Brahman, and I sometimes I think of the Father might be more associated with the idea of Brahman, and then you have Jesus, because he has no sin, has a perfect connection. So it's like there's Brahman, and then there's a channel between the temporal. So there's the eternal, the temporal, and then you have like the instantiation of God within the temporal, and that was within the symbolic order, and that's what Jesus is. And so the idea is you're trying to get back to the state of a lack of separation between God, but to do that, you have to like submit to God's will. Right? This is
Yeah.
within a Christian sense. And so this idea of sin, it is the idea that like going back to what I was saying before about our local neighborhood. So in the picture you gave with Atman and then Brahman, where I'm saying Brahman is like the realm of form, imagine it as a perfectly coherent structure that has no delusion, separation, or like things that create separation in this sense.
Mhm.
So in other words, that if I purify my local neighborhood, I purify myself, and you purify yourself, then when we come together, we actually see each other as the same in the same way as the cold welding. So the cold welding was really good because if you have impurities in you and you're full of sin, then when I come to interact with you, there's a degree to which I am not open to you. I
Yeah.
am creating separation between you. I'm listening to your words. I'm distorting them before they get here because your words may challenge my sense of self, which is a structure, which is an identity. And so what I do is I distort what you say. And then oftentimes, the reason why you live and abide in delusion is because you have an attachment to a self. And the truth, when it comes, might tell you that that self you have is false and you have to let it go. But then that's a death. And so you want to avoid death.
Right.
And so this is the nature of it. It's something like the degree to which we cannot become one being is the degree to which we abide in delusion and sin, and it's the degree to which we can't see the coherence. We can't see how we are one. It's, in other words, you're trying. If we all get to the point where we're purified, then you get to the what's like the bottom turtle, like the invariant God, the eternal invariant thing from which we're all reflections of.
I'm glad that you brought the bottom turtle into this conversation.
Yeah.
I agree with, it's hard not to anthropomorphize all this through whatever lens makes the most sense to you, because universal truths tend to come through whatever lens makes the most sense in the mind. But
Yep.
I
That's your local
fundamentally
neighborhood.
yeah, and that's in that local network could also be called Indra's net. And if we're going back into Eastern philosophy again, but
Yeah.
you know, I think that it's great that we're getting to this point with information. So, like, because we're coming to this through the ability to talk to each other on silicone chips with electricity running
Yeah.
through them.
Yeah.
And this is why, like, I'm not, I love looking at spirituality, but also through this scientific lens, and why I'm trying to deconstruct this thing that I seem to know to be truth in my own mind, trying to destruct it using language that is truth for others. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's fundamentally why my language might seem disparate, but it's just a part of the
I see
network
what you do.
dynamics of
Yeah.
collective intelligence. Like, I'm a little integration middle point between a bunch of different people, and so I'm gonna have you ever heard that quote, you are the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most?
No, I've never heard that.
Okay, well, I mean, you could look at it like that with language as well. Like, you're gonna take in influence from others. You're going to see things you like that people are doing. You're gonna be influenced by the truth of the situation, even though you guys might not even share any words with each other, just
Mhm.
by virtue of distance. And now we're going back into geometry and the Platonic space and quarter wave theory, because by virtue of distance, things can sum together just by being the right distance apart from each other. They don't have to say the same thing, but whatever they are saying, they have to say it with respect to each other. That's the
Yes. Yes.
interesting part, because
Yes. 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 Yes.
quarter wave rule seems to be a way to respect the signal over distance. And this is why I think using language like this is important, because it's multidisciplinary. And if the right person hears these words, they might say, oh, in my field of work, that actually makes perfect
Yeah.
sense if I apply it
Yeah.
this way. Right.
Well,
So,
that's the reason why I made the podcast and why I went made videos on YouTube. Like I literally get contacted by people like you and Dario, and like Dario listened to my video on information to broken symmetry. And like that's the Hegelian dialectic that's understood through Lacan by like Slavoj Žižek. And so like we start interacting, we start discussing over time. Like, oh yeah, and this is the whole point. This is the whole point of the cold welding. This is why everything is algebra. Everything is symmetry. Once you actually can construct the algebraic structure that maps between languages, then you can see that what I'm saying, what you're saying is the same thing. Oh, it's actually the same thing. We're just using different words to explain the same thing. And then that's when because each perception that you use comes with a self. Because how you perceive the world affects how you behave in the world, which means it affects your spirit when your spirit is understood as how you program the universe and how you program or how programmed by the universe, which is to say, how do you respond during an interaction? How do you behave? How do you program reality? And so for every perception and how you see reality, there is a spirit associated with it. There is a self. And so when I come to you and you're using a bunch of words and I don't understand what they mean, but then over time we interact and go, oh, this maps to here, this maps to here, this maps to here, this maps to here. Then that creates a coherent structure, and that's the code welding process. But you can't do that if someone refuses to acknowledge basic reality. That's a chair. Like, no, that's a dog. No, that's a balloon. And it's just like, we're not going to be building any structure together because you're just Murphy. We're not going to be building any structure together because you're lost in a delusion. I cannot
Yeah.
meld with you. It's not possible.
Well, delusions are a problem of a scale of time. Yeah, I don't have enough time to spend really convincing this person that what they believe is a delusion, so they're hopeless.
Well, no, that's the point. Sin itself is something that you have to overcome yourself. It may be the case that there is no time. That's the nature of sin. The nature of sin is such that it could be the case there is no time that could snap you out of it. You just have to and this is the whole idea within Christianity. It's like, this is what it's like to blaspheme against the Holy Ghost. It's something like, the more you lie to yourself and the more you sin, there's a certain point where you put yourself in a hole so deep. You're so separated from God. You're so separated from truth. You're so separated from reality that you can't come back from it. Once you see the nature of sin, especially how it's like biblically, how it is everywhere. And people are functioning out of it all the time. It's crazy.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I know you're Christian, but do you believe in reincarnation?
So it's interesting because my spiritual journey actually started with Buddhism. Well, it started with a bunch of stuff, but eventually it was like intertwining. I studied Buddhism and Christianity at the same time.
Yeah.
And so from my understanding, so the nature of Buddhism and the nature of reincarnation in Buddhism is actually quite strange. And it's something that I've grappled with and thought about. It's actually something you can't just accept, because within Buddhism, there's the idea of no self. Like, everything is every sense of self is dependently originated. So there's no actual like central self. And this is the same thing with Lacanian psychoanalysis, where he uses these topological structures like Mobius strips because he wants to communicate the idea of there is no orientability, which is to say there's no clear in and out. So this is the idea in Buddhism, dependent origination. There is no clear self in other, because you yourself are dependently originated. The self that is you is from the 5 aggregates. So the 5 aggregates are made of the temporal stuff that can come into a configuration. So you're made of the 5 aggregates. And so with that being said, within Buddhism, there's this idea of being reincarnated or past selves. But if the central tenet is the idea of no self, then what is that? And so there is this idea of karma and how karma works. And so it's actually very technical and nuanced as to what the hell they mean by reincarnation in Buddhism, given the idea of no self. And so within my understanding of reality, within my language, within what I've constructed, I think I can reconcile the nature of reincarnation as understood through Buddhism within how that might be true or manifested in reality. So it's something that I know at one point in time I thought about it in more detail. I could have given a better answer, but I have to go back and reconstruct my argument and my thought about that before I could give you different. But I think there's a way in which it makes sense.
So I think with most people in the world have this thing that they do where they anthropomorphize things because familiarity breeds understanding. And so I believe when people think about reincarnation, they think about, that there's like a soul inside me that creates Mike as a person, and the next life is going to be this exact type of person, right? I look at it more like the information processing pattern that creates Mike is possible of continuing onward, even if that's through other beings or an influence that I leave on this world. So I don't necessarily believe in reincarnation as in my soul is going to pop up in another vessel.
Yeah.
But I believe in the energy that is both moving through me, resonating in me, and moving out of me as tangibly receivable. Okay.
This, I think, is consistent with the Buddhism understanding. From what I can tell, I think that's the answer that they give. That's how it's understood.
Right.
Yeah.
There's
some invariant soul that hops from this body to that body. It's more of, like you said, these aggregates that have this karmic energy associated with it that didn't go, something like that.
And so actually interesting, if you're talking about attachment and karma and the relinquishing of attachment is part of the Buddhist lifestyle in releasing yourself from the bonds of samsara, because it's all a door that's open and you get to walk out of it at any time. It's just so interesting here. And so I think that that's the lens that I like looking at this all through. Less so than like purifying myself or not. It's I'm in prison, but the door's open and I can leave whenever I want. But I just have no fucking idea. Oh, excuse my language. I just have no idea
It's
what's
okay.
on the
Okay.
I just have no idea what's on the other side of that door. And this prison cell is just so comfortable. I get 3 square meals a day. I
Yeah.
know what's coming for me, right? And
Well, that's
so you've been a prisoner your whole life, but you can walk out anytime.
well, that's the thing is it's embracing death. There's a degree to which you have to embrace death to be free, to get into a
Yeah.
flow state. It's like Neo in the Matrix. That's essentially what it is. It's like whenever even within our own sense of identity, like I said, our self is associated with a structure, not just our physical matter and energy, but the blueprint, right? The spirit. That's what they would idea with the spirit part. It's like the blueprint, the waveform that tells the matter how to interact to create a specific structure. And so, if it is the case that spirit is understood by how you program the universe and how you're programmed by the universe, then your spirit is defined by interaction, like what happens during an interaction. So, for
Exactly.
example, this is why reputation, this is what reputation is. If I had to go start lying about who you are and what you've done, then the next time you interact with someone, they're going to interact differently based off that false information that I put out about you. And
Okay.
so, if it is the case that I have an attachment to a way people perceive me, right? Then if I go out into the world and I proclaim something or I do something that harms that their perception of me, then my spirit changes. And so there's a death of a self. The self of me
Yeah.
prior to my spirit changing is dead. Now now I have a new spirit such that I walk into a room and someone might try to stab me because of what they think about me.
Hmm.
And so this idea of like embracing, like escaping samsara and walking out the door, like you said, you're inside a prison cell and it's comfortable because there's something familiar and predictable about the situation you're in. To actually leave it requires you to step outside into a space of uncertainty and unpredictability, which this is going to some deep stuff, but it's the openness. It's the openness, like the vagina of reality. It's the openness of reality. And that's where the entropy is, that's where the uncertainty is, but that's where creation happens. And so if you are in the cell, then things change a little bit, but it's predictable. To go out into the wilderness is to expose yourself to the wilderness. You can
Yeah.
die on an adventure, but if you don't interact with entropy, then everything is predictable and consistent, and you're not alive. And so this idea to live is the degree to which you embrace the uncertainty of and go out and accept whatever happens. So in other words, if you go out into the wilderness, he died. Of course he died. He tried to go surfing shark infested waters. Of course he died. What do you expect? And but that's what you do when you embrace and accept whatever reality is. You don't try to go against it. You just flow with it. But that
Lest you become again as a child, you should not enter the kingdom of
yes, yes,
heaven.
yes, yes.
So the metaphors in religion are amazing. I love them. And to talk about sin again, real quick. To talk about sin real quick, this prison cell is a good analogy because it's something that we build ourselves to try to protect ourselves from sin. Right? We build this prison for ourselves, and we stay in this room to try to purify ourselves over time.
I feel like we build this, like the sin is what that's actually what this prison cell is made out of. Like we've attached our
Oh yeah,
identity.
I mean, the sculptor and the sculptist, it's all the same material, right? But at the same time, the only way out of this cell of sin that you both create yourself and are is to become something completely new and to basically relinquish everything you were. And
Yeah.
I am going to actually say an acid trip when I was younger, I
Hmm.
had I had a moment where you could say the beings or the reality in front of me told me that I would be given in my own lifetime the opportunity. I would be presented with a false version of infinity, right?
Mm.
There is a looming digital reality coming where people are going to talk about digitizing consciousness and living forever in the mind of robots and like getting rid of aging, right?
Yes,
But
yes,
I see this as a spiritual fallacy. And
yes.
I
I agree.
think that life itself is beautiful because the rose has thorns and because the rose wilts.
Hmm.
And there is a certain nature of reality that is here to stay, and there's a certain reality that's going to outlive us. But the fact of the matter is, we are temporary. And I
Yeah.
believe that that's what makes it all worth it. My
Yeah.
laptop is about to die, and I need to run downstairs to get the laundry out before someone steals it.
Okay. Man, I could get that.
Yeah, I
But
lost
yeah,
it.
man, things turned out really good. I'll let you go, and it's unfortunate because we could probably continue talking for hours, but I
Let's do
know
another
for
one.
yeah, we can do another one. It's like when we post this, I know what will happen is the conversation starts off incoherent because we're trying to establish like our shared language and structure, and then I think over time
Uh-huh.
it starts crystallizing into something real, something clear, which is good because I use that metaphor at the beginning of the episode, and I think that that's what happened. We went from a crowd of random directions to where we coalesced onto a one direction, and something coherent came out of it. So this was
Yeah, I
great.
think
Um,
both of us are trying to describe the mind of God using different language, I think.
I think we're using largely the same language, actually. There's not, it's not too hard to build a bridge between what we're saying, I think. So I think we have much closer neighborhoods, local neighborhoods, than I think a lot of people would typically.
That's why I reached out initially on your video, man. I could sense that you had a lens on this that was like the right lens, even though we're using slightly different language. You see the truth very clearly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so thank you for that. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, no problem. And I definitely, one reason why I interacted with you immediately is because I could tell the same. You are not, I'm certain that what you've constructed is not incoherent nonsense, and that you have a very strong, good intuition and working structure that you're seeing reality with.